if you're planning PT for your crew and you've got intervals, stress to them that like your first one and your last one should be within 1 to 2 seconds of each other. And that holds true for 400s. It holds true for mile repeats. You can even make that part of your work capacity. If you're doing two, 5 minute or 5 rounds, you want to see the time on that. And then if you repeat it again, you want to see a similar time. Like sustainability, I think, is ultimately what we're after with the tactical athlete, because rarely in a real world scenario do you want to completely gas yourself and fall flat on the floor. You want to be sustainable, and you can train that effectively if you play with your variables the right way. Am I doing the thing or are you doing the
thing? Do you want to like do it and then like ask me if I've got a testimonial to share?
Well, what I'm gonna say is, who do we have on tonight? And you're gonna say, no one, just us. Just teasing, just kidding. Okay. Welcome back, Leg Tuck Nation, to another episode of MOPs MOEs. I did it. I fucking just said I wasn't gonna do it, and I did it. Another episode of MOPs MOEs. Wait, fuck! I just lost my train of thought. Welcome to MOPs. Okay. Greetings, Leg Tuck Nation. Welcome back, Alex. Who are we talking to today?
Each other, I think. I don't see any guest around.
We are wearing matching shirts though, for everyone who can't. Well, no one can see this, but
pretty cute.
Matching blue shirts on.
Yeah, it's a good night. We want to start by saying we appreciate you guys, and we particularly appreciate you guys when you appreciate us. And a bunch of you have left reviews for the podcast, and we love all those. And we get some very nice DMs on the Instagram page and comments and things. And we want to start highlighting you guys a little bit and all the nice things you say. So we're going to share a quick testimonial we got today that had me pretty excited. We'll keep these anonymous unless the people want to have their names shared, and this particular individual did not. But he said, just want to say I appreciate all the info you share. Definitely been implementing what you guys talk about and suggest. I just hit max on deadlift and sprint drag carry for my ACFT and close to maxing the whole test. And we've heard that a whole bunch of times. We've also heard some pretty cool stories about units improving run times with the kind of polarized 80-20 zone 2 kind of stuff. All sorts of good stories coming from you guys. So just want to start highlighting that and sharing the success stories you guys have out there.
And that particular review or comment was especially fitting because tonight, well, in the episode today, what we wanted to do was dive into some of the X's and O's of training and programming. I think the bulk of our audience, well, the most vocal bunch of our audience tends to be professionals, coaches, researchers. But we do get a lot of feedback from soldiers and tactical athletes as well. And one of the requests that we've gotten more than once is just kind of how to train, how to program, how to put something together if you don't have access to a strength coach. And so we sort of decided to sit down with pen and paper and press record and kind of see where we go. So that's what we're getting into today. Hopefully there's some useful nuggets in there. Hopefully there's some things you can take away and implement into your own training. And we say this a lot, but if there's specific questions anybody has, or if there's things that they want us to touch on related to this type of thing, reach out, because we do see all that stuff and we do factor it into the things that we do want to talk about on the podcast.
Enjoy.
Nice. I was waiting for it. Boopy poppy boop, music, blah, 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 blah. Do you just want to run down that list? Or you have the framework in your brain. I'll just riff off of you.
In my brain. Oh boy.
Can't believe we're wearing the same colored shirt, man.
Aren't we great?
Look at us.
So if we're going to have a conversation about how to train and like how to program, I think a useful place to start might be, people ask on the page all the time, like, why don't you just post programs, or like, tell me what to do?
Tell me what to do.
Or the slightly different version of that, people will find a program and ask me if it's good. And I hesitate on all of those for kind of the same reason. which is it depends, which is the classic coach answer to any question about programming. But it's the right answer because they don't like to do a halfway respectable job of putting together some decent programming. You got to know the individual or the group's current level of conditioning, what they're trained for, what their strengths and weaknesses are, all that kind of stuff. You have to know what they have available. You have to know like frequency of training that they're planning on, and then frequency of training that they're accustomed to already. So whether they're ready to jump into whatever they're planning on, volume they're accustomed to, volume they're planning on, all that kind of stuff factors into doing a decent job of it. It's supposed to be individualized. And that's why I don't produce generic programming at this point. But it all starts in one place. And I've talked about this before. If you like have seen my stuff where I explain what the heck MOPs and MOEs is, or read like that article I wrote a while back, the key thing that people seem to miss the most is they just don't know what their goal is. Like if you walk into any given unit doing morning PT and ask them what the goal of their physical training program is, they'll probably look at you like you're crazy. Like, what do you mean goal? Or just exercising, get better at the test. I don't know, whatever. Shut up. And so step one is trying to figure out a good goal. And depending on where you are, there are some places where I can see it, but most places, most tactical professionals, I would rather see a goal that is tied to the actual physical demands of the job rather than something around the PT test they're going to have to take.
Yeah. I mean, I'll add to that because I think it, and I don't want to get like too cliche with this and talk about SMART goals because sometimes that works in this world, sometimes it doesn't. But I think having something that is quantifiable helps. I've gotten a lot of folks that will come to me and say, hey, I want to get strong or I want to get fast. And that's fine. I mean, that can provide a starting point if somebody knows what they're doing. But if you're just kind of sitting there on your own, putting something together for a, a platoon or a small group or whatever, I think quantifying it helps. And as I say that, I'm also thinking as well, like if I'm planning for a group, having a goal that's measurable that you can like literally put on a wall so people can see it can help, one, create buy-in, but then two, inevitably along the way, when it comes to training, people are going to ask questions and ask, why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? And if you can point to something, measurable, I think that's a lot more useful than, like you said, just like, oh, we're going to get better at the, PT test, or we're going to do this. Like in the grand scheme of things, that can still be the direction, but I think the direction is different from the goal, if that makes sense. I literally just made that up as I said it, but it sounds pretty good.
And even the process of trying to come up with the goal can be a good one, right? It makes you like look critically at what your mission set consists of and what pieces of that you're pretty physically prepared for and what pieces of it you're not as physically prepared for and might need to shore up and all that stuff. Because you said it and I'm lightly triggered, I'll provide a nerdy anecdote. Do you know where SMART goals came from?
Smart people.
Like the concept of SMART goals?
Corporate America.
Exactly. It is not an evidence-based method for goal setting that like is designed to improve behaviors or compliance or things like that. It comes from management because it's easy to like force people to do it and then measure them on it. So there's lots of debate on that one. I'll refer you over to a fantastic episode of Stronger by Science several months ago where they did like a deep dive on the science of goal setting. SMART goals are not actually necessarily the best way, but the Army loves them. So maybe keep doing them if your boss wants it, but who knows?
I mean, it's better than dumb goals.
It's true. Although maybe we could find an evidence.
I'm not even going to unpack what that acronym might.
No, we were just before we hit the record button, we were joking about how many bad acronyms we have, but now I really want to come up with a dumb goals acronym and like make it a thing.
Oh yeah. So if we assume then that somebody has their goal laid out, you touched on this a little bit, but if I put on my strength coach hat here, my next step is to kind of go to the opposite end of the time spectrum to, if the goal is the future, I think the next step is taking a look at the past and looking at somebody's training history. So again, we're still kind of in the planning phase. We haven't quite put pen to paper in terms of building out sessions and things like that. But oftentimes, and this gets to your point about templates and, folks just getting something online or throwing something together. If you don't take your training history into account, on the one hand, you open yourself up to injury, but on the other hand, you open yourself up to potentially missing performance gains. And when I say training history, what I mean is like, what does your run volume look like for the past couple of weeks? What are your kind of key lifts? You don't need like 1 rep maxes necessarily, but what are you kind of lifting right now? What are your preferred movements? What are movements that you don't like? As I've done this for longer and longer, I've started to ask a lot of kind of psychological questions too when I talk to potential athletes about this. Like, what movements get you excited? What movements demotivate you? Like, some people don't like doing heavy leg work. It gets them super demotivated and they don't want to go to the gym, and that's fine. Like, you just factor all of that into your decision-making process. But if you don't ask the question in the first place and you don't take anything related to anybody's training history into account, again, like, you're just going to throw something down on paper and then wonder why it's not working 3 or 4 weeks down the road. So start in the future, but then work your way backwards and figure out, what did the last 2, 3, 4 weeks look like? What, over the past couple of years, what has worked, what has not worked, and then factor that into what the starting point is going to be.
And I think a built-in assumption to what Drew just said and what I was saying before that is, there's 2 built-in assumptions here. The first one is when you're talking about designing programs for tactical professionals, you're usually talking about designing group training protocols, which brings its own whole layer of challenges, but to a certain degree also simplifies things because you're probably just going to ignore certain variables that are too hard to control. But the other piece of it is because it's a group, because it's probably a small unit, it's a really cool chance to like bring the unit together to like come to a consensus on some of this stuff. Like if the platoon as a group came up with this goal, there might be a little bit more buy-in around it. Or during the process, you might find that there's certain types of training that you guys really like and certain types of training that you guys really don't like. And all of those can feed in. Sometimes the training they really don't like is exactly the training you need to do because you've identified a weakness. So I'm not saying don't do it just because they don't like it, but bring the team in together, I think is probably valuable. And I know just from personal experience, being a platoon leader, you're a dumb lieutenant, but you have lots of ideas you think are good. But getting the guys in the room and finding out like, hey, like we haven't liked it the last couple of months because we missed this one thing we used to do monthly where we did this competition thing. Like, oh yeah, well, like shit, let's bring that back. That's easy. Or like finding out that one of your E4s has a degree in exercise science and like is brilliant at this stuff, and then you can tell him to do it. Life gets a lot easier. But lots of good reasons to bring the group in.
Right. Because the thing that I see happen a lot is whoever's designated, and this is talking specifically like a military group setting, like whoever's designated as the PT guy goes and creates a program and then slaps it down on the table. And it's like, here's what we're doing for the next week or for however long they're in charge of. It's like, okay, cool. But then you wonder why people don't want to do it. It's like, well, they didn't have any buy-in. And I think, again, we talked about this, and I want to try to plug as many of the episodes as we can that have talked about things, because I think some of the folks we have on have way more experience with this stuff than we do. This idea of buy-in is important because I think there's an assumption that in the military, because PT is mandated and because it's part of the culture, like people are going to do it, no questions asked. And that's just not the case. Like if you don't create that buy-in and excitement using some of the strategies you just mentioned and making it a group effort, again, you run the risk of 1, people just not doing it, 2, people half-assing it, and then potentially 3, getting hurt. And that's kind of the last thing that you want to deal with.
You talked about the PT guy and I come up with a weekly plan. That does remind me of one. We'll pretty quickly here get to like the things you should do. But one of the like nightmare things that a ton of units do that you should not do is the classic, like constantly rotating who's figuring out the plan and having it be people that are not coordinating with each other. So like one NCO on Monday, another guy on Tuesday, another guy on Wednesday, another guy on Thursday, who have not talked to each other at all. And who like all have totally different ideas. And like even worse, like texting them the night before being like, hey man, like you've got PT tomorrow morning, show up with a plan. Like if we can do better than that, oh, it'll help a lot of people, right? Like I don't need this like brilliantly periodized macro cycle of how you're going to peak for the deployment in 2.5 years. Like that, probably not likely. But like even just getting past these like obviously bad things of having people with like totally different ideas of what the goal is, programming stuff each day with no coordination is probably not smart.
Well, I mean, like, I don't want to sound like a total nerd, but like working out versus training, right? Like you can, and you've used the sauna example before, but like, and I've seen this happen live. A unit has thrown down a deck of cards and that becomes a workout. And like, that's fine. Like I have done deck of cards workouts. They're fun, but they're called deck of cards workouts, not deck of cards training, because you're literally just making something up. And if you want to like sweat, and that's cool, great. And I think even in a structured plan, there's room for like planned chaos. But to your point, like that's very different than saying, hey, you're in charge of Monday, you're in charge of Tuesday, you're in charge of Wednesday. And then you end up with this just complete randomness that doesn't really make anybody better. But let's get to some frameworks. Let's get to some X's and O's.
So we'll start with an easy one. I think this one is like, or at least versions of this one are pretty high, like well accepted, depending on who you talk to. But for picking, this is going to be specific to the strength part of the strength and conditioning equation. But I think breaking down the idea of movement patterns, because we've shopped this around and I've mentioned it on the page before, but I think a goal I have is to create like a 1-page checklist for how to plan PT. And with the attempts I've made so far, I think it'll have to be like a 1-page checklist. And then on the back of it, a page of like instructions on how to use the checklist to make it something good. But I think I can get it down to that. And that is something that could be like laminated and folded up and stuck in a cargo pocket or something. Cause that's kind of the dream, right? Because the Army doesn't do anything without checklists
or cargo pockets.
If you're going to call for a medevac, you have a checklist. If you're going to call for fire, you have a checklist. If you're going to like leave the patrol base, you do a GOTWA. Like there's like bullet point lists of what you're supposed to do for.
Can you go to the bathroom without a checklist?
Depends on the unit. But a piece of that checklist, one of the ones that I think is pretty easy and pretty useful, is the concept of movement patterns. And it's an imperfect approach because movement is not as like easily categorized as this, but I think it's still very useful to kind of look at your training and see which of these you're hitting and which you're not. And my concept for the checklist is that it will be something you have to like try and check all the blocks at least once a week. And that's kind of how I'd approach this too, is I would try and make sure you're touching each of these movements at least once over the course of the week. You might emphasize certain ones because they're more relevant to your goal, or it's a weakness you're trying to fix, whatever it is. But I would try and touch all of them. And there is room for disagreement on what counts as a foundational movement pattern.
But the breakdown I like starts with hinges and squats, which exist on a continuum from something like an RDL being a pure hip dominant hinge to something like a front squat being a pure squat.
Lunge, pushing and pulling, both are going to be upper body. And then for both pushing and pulling, you have horizontal and vertical. God forbid you do it at a slight angle that's not horizontal or vertical. It's just a useful classification. We said that at the beginning.
The system if you go 45 degrees.
Yeah, sorry. And then carries of all varieties. I know everybody loves a good farmer's carry, but you can do all sorts of different carries. Drags, and then twisting and bracing, which are kind of the opposite of each other, either like actively twisting against resistance or bracing when something is trying to twist you. Those would be my list. And then with like a bonus little asterisk of like try and do both bilateral and unilateral within those categories. So like both arms or one arm, both legs or one leg. You get it.
Yeah, I'm looking at it like, yes, I like the idea of movement patterns. And I as I think about this, like I've dipped in and out of this over the years. Because on the one hand, it gives you and I would actually argue that for the novice or the beginner or somebody who's just getting into writing programming, basing a lot of things off of these movement patterns is the right way to do it, because it does give you, it gives you puzzle pieces that you can play with. Hinging, squatting, lunging, pushing, pulling, carrying, dragging, twisting, and bracing. For me, twisting and bracing, the buzzword you'll hear a lot is core. I like that we've spelled it out as twisting and bracing. I don't think a lot of people realize that like your quote unquote core is designed to resist movement, not necessarily create movement. And you guys can fight me on that if you want. That's fine. Like, keep doing your crunches. But when we look at doing carries, and really a lot of like offloaded carries, contralateral carries, and basically what that means is just like doing things differently on different sides. That's where you can get a lot of bang for your buck in terms of capital C core training. And then you mentioned some of the frequency stuff. So like, I've seen success doing this a couple of different ways. You can kind of chunk all your lower body stuff into one bucket, chunk your upper body stuff into the other bucket. Like, I guess as a maybe a tip or a coaching tip on that front, like, pick an approach, plan out a week or so, and stick with that for a period of time to see what it creates on the back end, versus this week I'm going to set it up this way, next week I'm going to set it up that way. Like, you got to give your I call them phases, but you've got to give your phase or your week some time to mature and kind of feedback to you whether things are working or not. And what I mean by that is, like, if you put a lot of let's say you put your hinge pattern and your push, and I'm just making this up, but like, let's say we go hinge, push, carry on Monday. Like, leave that on Monday for a couple of weeks and see if the numbers are going in the way that you want them to go, versus week 1, Monday is hinge, push, carry, and week 2, it's squat, pull, twist. Because I've done both of those approaches, and I think that letting it mellow for a couple of weeks and letting yourself or the athletes that you're working with kind of get used to the movements is going to produce a much better result than constantly, I won't say constantly varied because I believe that's trademarked, but constantly changing things, while potentially fun, really chips away at your ability to create a feedback loop. And that's what ultimately what you're looking for. And I realize I went off on an absolute tangent there for movement patterns, but the takeaway is figure out your structure, which is something we'll dive into, and stick with it for a little bit to see if it's doing what you want.
And one thing to close out the movement patterns conversation, hopefully, thought of it as you were talking. A reason to go with movement patterns rather than exercises, or like really two reasons to go with movement patterns rather than exercises. One, movement patterns are equipment agnostic. Like, you can find things with any piece of equipment or no piece of equipment in each of those categories. Some can be kind of hard, like doing pull movements with no equipment whatsoever is pretty challenging. And making a hinge challenging, like making it hard enough to be useful with no equipment, is also going to be pretty hard. You can get real creative. I've seen some crazy stuff. But in general, this framework allows you, like, everybody gets mad at me for saying this, but you could put together a workout using just a couple sandbags or something. Or you could apply the exact same framework if you're in a gym with all the equipment you've ever wanted. So that's handy. And it allows you to have variety while still attacking the same components of your fitness, right? So you might do different types of squats, but you're still doing squats. You might do different types of pushes, but you're still doing pushes. And yeah, it just kind of like gives you a little bit more flexibility to make training not necessarily so boring. You hear all the time that like training should be boring. That's how you make it effective. I have moved away from that a little bit personally, because the best training is the training people actually do and get excited about and care about. And so some element of like variety and change there, I think, is pretty important. But yeah, hopefully that's helpful.
You hit on a pretty important thing there, and I'm going to repeat it, and it's probably going to make people mad. The exercise that you choose does not matter. Like, you're not a power lifter, and I'm speaking specifically to tactical athletes. You're not a power lifter. You're not an Olympic lifter. I mean, the ACFT does provide well, we say ACFT because Army, but any branch PT test does provide you with quote unquote sport specific movements. And so it makes sense at some point in your training to like insert those to get better at them. But outside of the time in which you're kind of peaking for that particular test, like to your point, the reason why the movement pattern construct, I would argue, is more effective is because, like you said, we can categorize a large number of exercises as quote unquote squats, back squat, front squat, split squat, Bulgarian split squat, hold a baby above your head, overhead squat, like a bajillion different. Instagram has a ton of them, but we're still focusing on that movement pattern versus saying we have to back squat, we have to deadlift, we have to, bench press. Like, yeah, those are great movements. You can load them a lot with barbell, like it's fine. But I guess why I'm saying that is because I intake a lot of athletes that think or have been told that there's like these like super movements that you have to have. And that's fine, but you also don't have to have them if you don't want them. Like if you like front squats and you don't like back squats, cool, we'll do front squats. Like it's not going to make you less of an athlete. We're just going to stick with something that you prefer. And if down the road we have a reason or a need to put the bar on the other side of your shoulders, then like we'll look at doing that. But no one's going to die if you don't, or if you leave squat, bench, deadlift out of your program. Sorry, strength coaches. Case closed.
Yeah, there's a whole rant there, but I'm gonna like hold back from getting too triggered.
So that's the movement framework. The other note that we have here is bilateral versus unilateral, which just from a definition standpoint, bilateral is when we'll think of it from like a squat perspective. You have both feet on the ground, or, if we're pressing something, we have both hands pressing it, and unilateral would be, one arm variations, single leg variations, etc. I think for the most part, we'll call it like in popular culture, popular fitness culture, you'll see a lot of folks kind of start the session with bigger bilateral movements. Typically that requires more muscle groups. It requires heavier loading. It requires you to be less fatigued, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that is true, you could argue. And then towards the end of the session, you get more towards your unilateral stuff, which tends to be a little bit more skill-based. There's some proprioception required, some balance. And I think that's a fine way to do it. You'll see a lot of unilateral type stuff in warm-ups quite frequently, which is good. I don't think any of that's bad. And I think it does give you a nice framework. So if we're thinking about this from like a session design standpoint, specific to the resistance training piece, and we're looking at, pick a random movement pattern, squats, like, your bigger bilateral squat pattern for the day, whatever it's going to be. And then as you get into your accessory work, start to inject some single leg stuff, some unilateral stuff. That's kind of how I would go with the bilateral unilateral piece.
Yeah. I guess I haven't thought about that as much. If I rewound a couple of years to when I'm like teaching a structured course, we used to talk about like exercise order after exercise selection. And that's where you get into like, first thing you want to do is speed and power. Then you want to do strength. Then you want to do like muscular endurance stuff earlier in the workout, compound structural, later in the workout, like accessory / fewer joints, whatever, all that kind of ordering stuff. And that's all good. That's useful. Like the idea of that is you put the things last that will be like least damaged by being pre-fatigued before them, kind of stuff, so that you can like maximize the intensity you train at throughout the session, yada, yada, yada. Just from like personal experimenting with myself, I haven't found that to be as crucial as I used to. I still do put like explosive speed and power stuff at the beginning of the workout, like warm up, then do that, then do whatever else is going on. But beyond that, I kind of order it where like whatever the primary focus of the session is going to happen first, regardless of what that is. Like if my goal is primary, like if I'm really interested in like the aerobic conditioning that I'm going to do during the session, and whatever strength stuff is not as high a priority, then I might do the aerobic stuff first, even though that's contrary to what like a textbook would tell you to put in order.
Yeah, well, the textbook's wrong. No, I'm not kidding, but I'm kidding. No, I think I like that you said that, because you're right. If you look at the traditional approach, it would be to say that you do like these, speed, power, or whatever, and then assuming you get more and more fatigued as you go, you get into your less damaging, less like fatigue inducing movements. And like you said, that's a fine construct and it works, but I'm with you in that I would argue that the session order, and you can kind of go off the rails here into a rabbit hole about concurrent stuff, aerobic versus strength, which you touched on, and how do you order that stuff? My answer would be the same to both of those, which is to say that like prioritize the thing that you want to get better at, because you will undoubtedly be more fresh, more motivated at the beginning of the session than you will be at the end. So if that means that strength is the thing that you're after, then like you can do your strength stuff first and then do like speed work or plyometrics later. That's totally fine. The reason I say that is because, especially when I think about this from a group setting, if you go into this thinking things have to be done in a certain order, or else some like mythical physiological beast is going to descend and steal everyone's gains, you can get a little bit hamstrung, no pun intended, when it comes to managing the session. Because if you got like 20 dudes and 3 barbells, and in your mind you have to do the lift thing first, you're going to end up with a lot of people standing around. Whereas you could have some folks cycling through different pieces of the session in different areas of the gym. And I promise you, it's going to be fine.
I'll ask you a question. You might know more on this than I do. I'm kind of agnostic on it. What's your opinion on finishers? Like burnout set kind of stuff, or Metcon stuff at the end, like whatever your version of a finisher is. What do you think about that concept?
So I actually like it. And there's a reason for that. Well, there's a couple reasons for that. When I first started working in tactical strength and conditioning, and my background, just for context, is I came from sort of CrossFit, SEAL Fit, Jim Jones. I did all of that before I got into the traditional kind of collegiate. Granted, my collegiate experience was overseas, but whatever. So I came into strength and conditioning having done a lot of these finishers, Metcons, whatever. So I say that because when I started working with tactical athletes, I realized that a lot of those guys came from a similar background. When they thought of training, they thought of it in terms of Metcons and things like that. And so instead of doing, and this is like a really stupid example, but I would do, instead of saying, hey, we're going to do 3 sets of back squats, I'd say we're going to do 3 rounds. And like little things like that, buy-in went through the roof, because now all of a sudden it looked like the thing that they were used to. And so to bring this back to finishers, thinking about it from like, hey, it's good to have some core stuff. It's good to have some calisthenics. It's good to have just some like skill kind of work capacity type stuff, whatever that means. Like the finisher area is a good place to throw that. One thing that I will add, and kind of shout out to Marcus Philly for introducing me to this concept, because he does this a lot with his finishers, is you can be very creative with it, with your movement selection, depending on whether or not you want to ratchet up the intensity or ratchet down the intensity. So like if I'm training somebody for selection or for something that's going to involve a lot of chaos and a lot of intensity, then the finisher, I can make that piece of work longer, and I can also make it more intense by throwing in a lot of cyclical stuff, throwing in a lot of fast repetition, a lot of fast movement. So it might look like, 20 minutes of work, you're doing 15 calories on the assault bike, you're doing kettlebell swings, you're doing sled pushes, you're doing like high turnover movements. That's like one category of finisher. The other category is where I want to ratchet things down. And that's more of like a skill-based thing. And to do that, and this is where I'll give the nod to Marcus Philly, like introducing a lot of isometric type stuff, a lot of carries. That's a really easy way to sneak rest in without just straight up saying rest. So that same 20-minute piece of work might have the assault bike, but instead of going from the assault bike right to the burpees or the sled push, we go to a plank, or we go to like a static hold with kettlebells. Like it still feels like work, but you're bringing the intensity down and actually slowing the athlete down to change the outcome, if that makes sense. So that might've been a long answer to the finisher question. I guess the short version is, yeah, I like them. And it's a great way to be creative if you know what you're doing.
You snuck in a trigger word there that's going to piss off a lot of coaches.
Marcus Philly?
No, you said burpees.
Burpees? Do people get pissed off about burpees?
People get real mad.
Why?
I'm still unclear on it. I think it's just a popular thing to hate. I don't know.
So fun fact, the burpee was created as somebody's PhD product. And I think his last name was Burpee. I could be super wrong.
That sounds right. I feel like I vaguely remember that.
fact check me on that, but I think it was a movement. Something about it was designed to be like an all-encompassing full body something or other. People hate. I mean, like I hate burpees; they're not fun. But
if I recall, and this is shout out to a previous episodes because you said we're going to try and highlight as many previous episodes as possible. When Colonel Gist was on, I believe some of his stuff is on brief bouts of like burpee intervals as a way to like sustain fitness levels without access to much stuff over long periods. And
burpees
it seemed to, I'll go back and try and find the paper or something and find out whether it worked pretty well. I know it wasn't perfect, but it seemed to do a pretty good job if you don't have access to a lot of stuff.
I mean, this is forever ago, but I remember the CrossFit Open one year, it was 7 minutes of burpees. That was the whole thing.
I've done the, like how many burpees you can do in 5 minutes or how many burpees you can do in 10 minutes. It's pretty savage. If you're trying to build mental toughness, I'm sure it does that.
This episode brought to you by burpees.
Oh boy.
What's triggers people?
But we've talked a lot. Well, actually, before we close out,
that answer the finisher question. Is that stone turned? Okay.
I think so. But we have to move on to the conditioning stuff. But one thing we didn't really touch on necessarily was like frequency and volume. And I don't think it's really possible to give like a generic answer for anyone on frequency and volume. We will, at the end of the episode, I will ask you how many days per week should you dedicate to like strength versus endurance versus whatever, but that will kind of be our closer.
Yeah, because the answer I'm coming up with is going to touch on that anyway. So we'll wait on that one. Let me just add one more thing on finishers, because I see this happen a lot. And in my opinion, the finisher is not an excuse to just smash everyone's face into the ground to think that you've had a good workout. Like, do a finisher, but it's also okay to walk away from a training session feeling good. And by good, I mean standing up and like breathing well.
Yeah, it's a whole separate episode, but like I've been playing with it myself a little bit and looking at some of the literature on the topic of like exercise for like behavioral health and mood. I've played with a lot trying to find like a session that like does the most for my mood. Ironically, given that it's like doctrinal in the Army, 30-60s and 61-20s have been great for me in terms of like mood boosting effect. I might be crazy. I don't know, but they've done well for that. Not like Drew said, I don't do it to like absolutely ruin myself. I do it at like a pace where I can repeat the effort every time. And I end up walking away like, yeah, sweaty and tired and stuff, but like also like feeling much better mentally than I did before I went into the session. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy.
No, I'm with, and like, I want to try to touch on that without diving down a completely different rabbit hole around like work capacity, but talking about finishers and specifically, like you mentioned, talking about intervals, like you can set it, and maybe we touch on this with conditioning. I don't know. I'm kind of thinking out loud here.
Yeah, that's where we're going.
Yeah, let's go down conditioning first, and I'll see if there's an opportunity to bring up the conversation around sustainability.
Okay.
Ready to go.
I'm going to like risk opening Pandora's box here because we got to like define some terms before we do this whole conditioning thing. And back in the day, it's been a long time since this has happened. When I talk about how I think broadly, if we look at strength and conditioning, one of the issues is that there is a lack of focus on conditioning for many of these folks. And I think a lot of that stems from a phenomenon where obviously most of this comes from sport. And if you're dealing with like field sport athletes, it's a fairly safe assumption that a lot of their quote unquote conditioning / endurance volume is going to come from practices they're doing anyway, away from the coach. And I think we see some of this because they're routinely referred to as just strength coaches instead of strength and conditioning coaches. Many strength coaches come from backgrounds that are kind of like powerlifting or Olympic lifting centric, which is like not something where your conditioning is going to be tested as much. That's ignoring the whole conversation about how improving your aerobic capacity improves your tolerance for volume and training. We're going to forget about that for a second. That's just to say that, and like there are some historical anecdotes to back this up, right? When like looking at the military or the Army specifically, when Ranger Regiment introduced coaches, guys got bigger and guys got stronger, and that's super cool. But there was like a moment there where their aerobic performance started to have serious problems. And I've seen this in a lot of places where you introduce coaches, and like everybody loves to get jacked and strong and stuff, and it's sexy and it's cool and it looks good on Instagram, and I got it. But like, if I'm being honest, I think for most tactical professionals, the conditioning is going to be more important than the strength. And we have talked about this before. There is such a thing as strong enough for your job. It's hard to imagine like a ceiling on conditioning where it wouldn't be helpful to have more. And then I'll put a tiny asterisk on this before I let Drew respond. But it is true that conditioning and endurance are not necessarily synonyms. Like you can condition with things other than steady state stuff or like intervals on some sort of endurance modality, whatever. Like, yes, that is true. But that doesn't mean you can ignore the steady state aerobic kind of stuff. Like it is still totally important. Like, yeah, you could do conditioning that's like weight based or something. That is absolutely true. But I think most of what we're going to talk about here falls into the buckets of like aerobic, like sustainable long duration stuff, endurance, and then what is typically called anaerobic or like short duration bouts above sustainable intensity. We've nerded out on previous episodes about why anaerobic might not be the most appropriate term, but it's the term everybody uses, and that's fine. So that's mostly what we're going to talk about here with conditioning.
Yes. I want to organize my thoughts so that we don't open up Pandora's box. First of all, yes, I vehemently agree with the fact that most strength and conditioning coaches have no idea how to program for conditioning, which, is probably its own episode or series of episodes. The conditioning piece is, and I don't remember if when we had Scott Johnson on talking about zone 2 stuff, I don't remember if we mentioned the sandcastle analogy or not.
Oh yeah, it made it in there.
Okay, perfect. And if you didn't listen to that episode, one, you should, but if you did not, you would not have heard the sandcastle analogy, which is one of my favorites in terms of how we think about endurance. A lot of people think, so sandcastle is sand and water, right? And conditioning is kind of the same thing. It's volume and intensity. So a lot of people think that water is kind of the key ingredient, water being intensity, to building a sandcastle. But realistically, if you have a ton of dry sand, then a little bit of water, a little bit of intensity can actually allow you to create a pretty steep pyramid, a pretty big sandcastle. And I mean, there's a lot more to that analogy that Scott dives into. You can also just Google uphill athlete, sand, water, and read into it. But the key takeaway there, I think, to the point you just made, is like, you can be strong enough. You can reach a ceiling in terms of like, the difference tactically between somebody that can deadlift 400 versus 500 pounds, probably not that much when we really get down to it and like bullets are flying. The difference between somebody that can sustainably move for 10 miles without feeling like ass versus somebody that gets smoked after a 1 mile run is incredibly important when bullets start flying. And so you can always push the needle on the endurance, on the conditioning side of things. And what that means from a programmatic standpoint is it's okay to drop quite a bit of the volume, quite a bit of the frequency on the resistance side of the house and still maintain a pretty decent level of strength and free up a ton of adaptation currency, a ton of fatigue, free that up for focusing on the endurance piece. Because, I mean, we saw this with my brigade recently, and I think a lot of folks in the military with the ACFT now are seeing the same thing. And far and away, the worst event that everybody has on the test is the 2 mile run. So, you talk about low hanging fruit, like injecting some well thought out endurance training is going to have a massive return on investment in terms of improving test scores and just having people be healthier all around.
I will briefly expand on a term you just used there, and it's good timing. We did not talk about this before the episode, but I have like drafted up an Instagram post about adaptation currency that I haven't posted yet. The concept here being you can only stress people so much and still have them improve their performance because of it. At a certain point, you're hitting diminishing return stuff. You have exceeded their capacity for adaptation. And everybody's going to have a different amount of quote unquote adaptation currency. It's going to be influenced by genetics. It's going to be influenced by their current fitness state. Lots of things are going to play into it, but you can only empty the tank as much as you are filling it up. Other things do empty the tank besides training. Training is one of the stressors a person might experience, but every other stressor counts. If you're doing lots of demanding stuff for the job, that is part of emptying the tank, expending adaptation currency. If lots of stressful stuff is going on in your life, that is also expending adaptation currency. And frankly, consuming alcohol is also expending adaptation currency. So lots of those things are like withdrawals from your account, and your recovery determines the deposits you're putting in your account. Are you getting enough sleep? Are you fueling properly and sufficiently? Are you hydrating properly and sufficiently? And then you have to make smart decisions there about like, and you see it a lot, like just nobody cares, work harder kind of stuff. Like just like, who cares that you got 4 hours of sleep? You got to still hit the gym at 5 a.m. and then do 2-a-days and all that stuff. And surely that's going to make you better. And I hope that people are like keeping track. And this is why you have to have a goal. And this is why you have to monitor your performance. But if you could get fitter faster by doing less work, then that's probably what you should do. And that comes back to adaptation currency and making smart decisions about how much volume and intensity is appropriate. Anyway.
Well, no, what you're talking about, I mean, just for everybody who likes to Google things, it's the fitness fatigue model, essentially, which is, I don't want to say it counters super compensation theory, but it certainly provides a more robust framework for how human beings actually adapt to stuff. And to your point, like what that model essentially says is performance is the sum of the fitness piece, which includes the adaptation currency that you have available to utilize for fitness. So the fitness piece minus the fatigue piece. And so, if you don't sleep well the night before you train, you're going to be bringing in so much more fatigue into that session than you would have otherwise. And so the return on investment from a fitness standpoint might be the same because the session itself is the same, but the bottom has fallen out because we have more fatigue going into it. The sum of those two parts essentially leads to lower performance. So again, that's probably one of those things that could have its own episode, and it probably should, but in the interim, just Google fitness fatigue model, and that'll have more than enough information on what you kind of touched on there.
Cool. Do we want to lay out the list of like conditioning modalities here that we have written down? I can do that.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. And some people may disagree that all of these things count as conditioning. I basically just split the list into like strength stuff, which was the movement patterns, and conditioning stuff, which is everything else. So like some of these might not sound like conditioning to everybody. It's just kind of how I bucketed it here. But the first one is aerobic. And I defined that earlier as like an intensity level that you can sustain for an extended period of time. It's sustainable. Anaerobic, which I put quotation marks around to keep Drew happy, because we know that it's not actually anaerobic. There's still aerobic activity going on, but there's like anaerobic metabolic pathways are being relied on slightly more, whatever you want to do, however you want to term it. But what we mean by that is bouts of higher intensity activity that are not sustainable. You're going to have to take rest periods, yada, yada. And there could be rest periods in aerobic activity too. We're getting into fuzzy labels and stuff. It's all on a continuum. And then the next three are not everybody would I put them in the conditioning bucket necessarily. One is agility. And Drew and I talked about this term the other day. Some people might say it's agility as long as it incorporates like change of direction. If we're going by like strict words mean things kind of definitions and stuff, agility really involves reaction time, like an external stimulus of some kind. So you would want to incorporate that component of it as well.
Well, that means that your agility ladder is not an agility ladder. It's just a ladder.
That is what it means.
Just to throw that out there and make some people upset. Like agility by definition is a reaction to something. So if a strong safety is about to tackle you and you move out of the way, that's agility. If you do some dance on top of a ladder, that's not agility. That's you're dancing on a ladder. Sorry.
Now we're hurting feelings.
Next topic.
The next one, I use the term explosiveness as like a bucket that contains both speed and power. And so that's anything like linear and very like maximal acceleration kind of stuff. And then the last one I put on here, and I think this is one we forget about a lot, particularly in a military population that is totally trainable, is balance. It's not sexy to train it necessarily, but it is trainable. And when I think about injuries that have happened to soldiers I have worked with, like out in the field, like things we might have, I don't know if we would have prevented them or not, but a lot of these injuries involved navigating complex terrain while carrying load and losing balance, right? And in most of the cases I can remember, it also happened at night. So you have that extra factor of not being able to see really well. And I'm not basing this on science. I don't have evidence to go with it, but I feel like if we put a little bit of time into balance training, it would probably pay dividends in like a quote unquote injury prevention kind of thing. Not to open a separate Pandora's box, but the like just observational study here. Back when I was teaching the Master Fitness Trainer course, I remember the first time they had me lead the strength training circuit where you get to like pick some exercises and put them in a circuit. I included single leg RDLs on there, and it immediately became clear that assuming soldiers can balance on one leg proficiently at all is not a safe assumption. There's huge deficits in the balance department. So a lot of people might not consider balance a conditioning modality. I'm going to put it in that bucket here and say it should probably be on your checklist to incorporate to some degree. And you might do that just by including unilateral exercises, like we said before, but definitely have balance in there somewhere.
I remember this was years ago. I wrote an article. It's online. You can find it. I think Uphill Athlete has it. Anyway, from a tactical standpoint, basically classifying conditioning in a similar way to what you just did. And if I recall correctly, the three that I came up with were endurance, stamina, and work capacity. And it kind of worked its way down in terms of volume and then worked its way up in terms of intensity. And endurance to me, and I've probably changed my mind on this a little bit, but it still kind of holds true. So endurance is just kind of open-ended, long distance, sustainable, something that you could do for quote unquote forever. And programmatically, what that looks like is, a lot of your long ruck stuff, a lot of your longer distance running. If you want to be non-impact with it, that's fine. Long rowing, biking, you could even put swimming. But the point is that it's long. It's at a pace that you could sustain for much longer than the actual session itself. And we could probably cage that in the zone 2 category if we wanted to go at it from that direction. The stamina one is a little bit more wonky because I didn't make up the word stamina, but in this context, I kind of made up the framework for it. So stamina to me is a little bit more closed-ended. It's your longer interval type work, stuff where there's a set time and we're looking to sort of maximize the effort for the time that we're given. So it's a little bit different from the endurance piece in that it's not open-ended, it's more direct, but
we're talking about AMRAP kind of stuff here now. If you're going to put a CrossFit,
sort of. Although I would almost throw that into this third one, which is work capacity, which to be honest, like for my entire career, work capacity has been sort of the elephant in the room, in the sense that I would argue that work capacity is one of the more vital components to a tactical athlete's program, but it's the least researched, in the sense that you do see a lot of stuff out there around reps and sets and resistance training coming from sort of the powerlifting space. And then you see a lot of stuff from track and field talking about intervals but that's all single modality stuff. Work capacity, I would say, is the piece of the puzzle that like CrossFit introduced. And there's a lot of wonkiness in there. There's a lot of randomness. And to me, that's okay, because at the end of the day, war, combat, whatever you want to call it, has the same squishiness to it. And so as as a younger strength coach, as I was thinking about all these types of things, caging it in those 3 buckets gave me some variables to play with in terms of, okay, this is going to be more of an endurance focused session. That's where I'm going to throw my long distance stuff. This is going to be a stamina session where we're doing intervals. We're doing hard but sustainable work. And then the work capacity piece is where we're going to throw in your sled pushes, your carries, your assault, like just the quote unquote chaos piece, but not so chaotic as to be random, because we, again, cage it in that definition of work capacity. So when I look at the checklist you have, I agree with all of it. For me, I go at it from a slightly different direction, which is what's the most simple approach we can take and what's the fewest number of variables we can play with.
So like 3 things come to mind there to respond to that. One, you talk about the simplest approach possible. And I think that's like key. And we might have already overcomplicated some of these things more than we needed to. So sorry.
We tend to do that. Sorry.
But as I've like seen programs that have been successful in this like tactical group setting type of stuff, a theme is that they are much simpler than like social media or textbooks would have you believe they need to be, right? Like there's lots of conversation about like periodization and how much to progress week to week and individualization and all of these things. But I see like really, really successful programs that they don't have structured progression in the program at all. It's just when you come into this facility, you're going to check the following boxes during the session, and that's it. And it works pretty well, and people get excited about it if you execute it effectively. The next thing, this is just a complaint, and you don't even have to respond to it. I get a little salty sometimes that this whole like human performance field has all these like terms with fuzzy definitions. Like not everybody agrees on what work capacity might mean, and not everybody agrees on what anaerobic might mean, or not everybody agrees on which energy system model to use, whatever it is. But part of why it frustrates me is because the field also borrows all these terms from physics that have really clear definitions. Like work, like is just force times distance. Like that is what work is. And then power is force times distance divided by time. And even something as simple as like jerk, like we think of it in the clean and jerk sense, but like jerk is the rate of change of acceleration, right? That's what it is. It's a term. It's defined. You can measure it. It's the derivative of acceleration. Got it. So like we take these like super clearly defined terms and then use them in these really fuzzy ways where we start talking about work capacity and not everybody agrees on what that means. I don't know if that was helpful.
No, I'm with you. Work capacity to me is metcons. I mean, that's just the easiest way to say it, I think.
But what does metcon mean?
Yeah, right. Okay, fair. So if I'm talking to an athlete and I say
metcon, the term, when you think about it for a second, like metabolic conditioning your attack, like what does that mean?
Let's just call it lowercase c CrossFit, and let's take out the muscle ups and the things that are sport specific to lowercase c CrossFit, and just call it like, because that's I know what you're saying, and I get it. Like it overcomplicates things, but I think if we're all in agreement that like it's okay to explore combining some endurance stuff and some strength stuff into the same time domain, and like, oh my God, heaven forbid you go from a barbell to an assault bike, like that's not, no one's going to die. That to me is work capacity. And I know that, like you said, everybody's going to come at that with probably a different definition, and that's fine, as long as you can put some constraints in place so that you don't hurt people, and then explain that effectively to the athletes that you're working with.
Cool. Now I'm going to ask a much more direct question that I think is relevant here. This comes up a lot, lots of DMs on the Instagram about this. We've talked about zone 2 before. If you follow this podcast, you probably heard the conversation, talked about like polarized endurance training, 80-20, whatever you want to call it. And so Drew, I'm going to ask you a direct question on that topic. What is the minimum volume of weekly endurance work that you should be doing before polarizing makes sense? Right. Cause there's an amount, I don't know if there's like a clear definition of this. It's probably individualized and stuff, but if you only do any kind of endurance training for like a total of a half hour a week, you're probably going to make more money doing like interval stuff, like running some 400s or something. But
see, I don't know how true that is.
I know.
I've heard that. And I don't,
my anecdotal experience,
I don't know,
seems to back that up. I haven't looked at research on the topic, but
because people that came. So there's a funny story sort of to that, which was that like several years back when like I won't name names, but like high intensity endurance became like the thing, and they found that when traditional runners did high intensity training, oh my God, they got so much faster. And what no one really thought about was the fact that the people they were looking at brought years and years and years and years and years and years and years of volume into that setting. And what I think then happened was, because at the same time we were seeing this rise in functional fitness, people thought, oh, well, if I don't have a ton of time to train, I can just go really freaking hard.
And those people did not bring that base of volume.
Those people did not bring that base of volume. And so you had to really be paying attention to the space to see this happen. But the people that were touting this high intensity model slowly started making less and less noise, because I think they realized, oh, wait a second, like you've got to have a pretty big base of endurance for this. And the analogy,
okay, I mean, even in the CrossFit space, look at how popular aerobic stuff has gotten. Right?
Exactly.
There's like a system-wide acknowledgement that we have to do some aerobic conditioning.
Like intensity work sharpens the knife, but if there's not a knife there in the first place to sharpen, you're just banging flint and steel together. You're not really doing anything. So all that being said, to answer your question, I don't want to say it depends. I will use an example. of an athlete that I'm actually working with right now. Shout out Allie. We've been working together for a few weeks, and basically we're in a fact-finding phase of, and she's doing concurrent training. So she's doing strength work and endurance work. And on the endurance side of the spectrum, we've stayed in the zone 2 low intensity space, and we've slowly ratcheted up the volume of that to see at what point I start to get feedback mechanisms letting me know that the frequency, the volume, the intensity is a little bit too high. And what I'm looking for in that case is like, hey, I'm really sore going into my strength session the next day, or hey, like pretty beat up, blah, 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 blah. So whatever number that becomes, that to me is the answer to the question of how much volume needs to be in place before you start polarizing. Because for some folks, if they don't have a very big background in the endurance space, it might be like 2 to 3 30-minute runs a week reaches that tipping point of this feels like too much. And you'll see, the strength numbers might drop, the subjective feedback might drop, like we just talked about. I've heard other folks talk about like, the guidelines for healthy living, whatever, Canada has them, the United States has them, United Kingdom has them. There's guidelines in there for what is deemed by the medical community to be a healthy amount of volume. And I think that stuff is sound, but I would rather see folks kind of experiment and say, okay, based on your training history, which we talked about at the beginning of the episode, why don't we start with, we'll make it up. Why don't we start with 2 30-minute sessions a week on the endurance side of things? It's going to be zone 2. It's going to be easy work. After 1 or 2 weeks of that, we're going to ratchet it up to 35 minutes or 40 minutes. And then you'll know when you reach that point of like, hey, this feels like a good amount of volume. Then one of those endurance sessions is going to turn into, for me at least, instead of just dropping that entirely and going straight to speed work, because there's a lot of risk in that, I'll keep the volume the same and throw in some surges or some speed work within the run. Once that becomes, part and parcel of the program, then we'll transition more towards direct intervals. But I think to take your question kind of a step further, when people do start to polarize stuff, there's a risk of just dropping entirely away from endurance, long, slow distance stuff and throwing in like 100-meter repeats, and then you get hurt.
Drew took a long road to get there, and he's extremely passionate about the topic.
A long zone 2 road, a long steady state road to get there.
I will throw out, after having talked to a few people about this, Drew being one of them, but several others, it seems like there's a decent consensus, if we're looking for like a quote unquote minimum effective dose here, is at least 2 to 3 sessions of at least 20 to 30 minutes of that like low intensity zone 2 stuff. Mm-hmm. Establish that floor of consistency before you start sprinkling in the other stuff. And that will help you build a respectable base. And you can obviously build on that a ton. And like, it's also nice, like you may not end up, because we're talking about like how to build programs for groups in tactical environments. And what I will tell you for damn sure is that sergeant majors do not like seeing people doing zone 2 conditioning during PT. So you might have to have a conversation about like what you're trying to do and the reason why. Or the alternative approach is either like create time for people or encourage people to use their own time. I'm a big fan. This is going to sound cheesy, but I'm a big fan of the zone 2 in a TV show kind of thing.
Oh, hell yeah.
Like, hop on a bike, throw something on, hop on a treadmill, do some like walking / really slow jogging kind of stuff, whatever it is. But like you can, it ends up being like a pretty nice experience all around, and you can build up a solid amount of volume over the course of the week, or like take phone calls while you do it, whatever it is.
Yeah. And I think just to maybe put a bow on this piece of it, like, and because I think it's important, once you hit that minimum effective dose and what you laid out, I think is perfectly fine. Don't then just go immediately to speed work. Like start to titrate into speed work by injecting some of it into that zone 2 stuff, into that easy run stuff. So if it is 3 30-minute runs a week, that's cool. But as you move towards, I think what a pretty standard endurance model is, which is kind of a speed day, a tempo day, and an endurance day, which we can get into that later. But as you move towards that, be sure that you're doing it deliberately and not just, week 6, we're finishing up with the 3 easy sessions. And then week 7, we're hitting intervals, because you're going to mess some people up if you go that direct.
Okay. I'll try and move through the next few things kind of quickly, because I think we're starting to get longer on this episode than I expected to get.
Oops.
By talking about the like aerobic sustainable stuff, we kind of implicitly define the like quote unquote anaerobic higher intensity stuff. There's obviously that range there. Drew mentioned that like one end of that range is like straight up speed work, which I would probably put in the explosiveness bucket I mentioned before. And then somewhere in between there is like a variety of modalities of intervals, right? And this is where you're going to hear terms like maximum aerobic speed, or like, and then you get in conversations about like what work to rest ratio is the right one for the goal you're training for. Like you could do 400s and you could start out with like a 1 to 2 work to rest ratio where you rest twice as long as you did the 400. And instead of progressing the speed you do it at or the number of reps you do, you could try and just shorten the rest time between them and sustain the same pace. There's lots of ways to play with it when you're starting to talk about interval stuff, depending on what your actual goal is. Drew, stop me if you have notes you want to make.
Well, I'll say, no, I'm glad you brought that up, because I'll try not to get long-winded here, but like the variable that you manipulate is going to determine the stimulus that you get from the session. And intervals is a great example to use for this because it's pretty straightforward. If you make the interval longer, so if you go from like a 400 to a 600, you're getting more into like the speed endurance piece. So if the athlete is hitting 400s at a particular pace, say that they're doing it at their goal 2 mile pace, and they can sustain 400s, then if you increase that to 600s at the same pace, you're taking that speed and you're making it longer. That should make sense. If you add intervals to that at the same pace, so we're still doing 400s. Let's say the first week we did 4 of those at that pace, and then the next week we did 6 of them. That's still speed endurance, but I kind of just think of that as more of an endurance thing. So we're increasing the athlete's ability to sustain that pace, but they're not quite at the point where they can make it go longer. We're just stacking volume on top of it. So I kind of went 1 step forward, 2 steps back there in terms of how I would progress somebody. Chopping the rest away is good if they get to the point with relatively longer intervals. So again, if we're looking at that 2 mile example and we're up to like doing 1,000 meter or 1,200 meter repeats, mile repeats even, that's where I would start to play with chipping away at the rest, because ultimately by doing that, what we're trying to move them towards is the sport specific distance that we're after. So if it's a 2 mile and we've built up to the 2 mile distance through a series of intervals, and the athlete has shown that they can sustain that pace for whatever distance it is, then we chip away at the rest. And that gets us to arriving at that kind of sport specific goal, which is an unbroken 2 mile. I tried to keep that short. Did that make sense?
It made sense. And I also forgot a key thing that I like to reinforce here. The one running program framework that like every Army unit seems to understand is the ability group run, where you like break up based on your 2 mile time and you all go run as hard as you can for the same route, which ends up producing the stupid outcome of volume could be measured in distance. And if that's the case, then everybody's doing the same amount of volume, kind of, but volume could also be measured in time. And the result of that would be that your best runners who have the tolerance for the most volume are actually doing the least volume in training. And your slowest runners who have the least tolerance for volume are doing the most volume in terms of foot time during training. And as like a former nerdy A group guy, that means your A group guys get back. And especially during the winter, they end up getting pissed off because they're like standing under the awning behind the cough, waiting for everybody else to get back. And they start doing like cheesy nonsense that wasn't very structured. You start doing like wall sits or core work or something like that. It just gets dumb. So I would strongly encourage programming based on time rather than distance.
Yes.
Strongly encourage.
Yes, I agree with you. And I call it task versus time, because you can stretch this out to the work capacity thing we just talked about and do it the same way. 20-minute AMRAP versus just 5 round. Like 5 rounds would be task, 20 minutes would be time. The time piece to me, and especially with endurance, I would say 99% of my endurance work is time, for that exact reason. Like it's easier to do it for a group. It's easier to make metrics off of it. The 80-20 thing that you talked about is it's easier to build that out if you're doing things based on time. The difference for me when I start to make it when I make it more task-based, or I inject specific time or specific distance, is when we need to get more sport specific leading into a PT test or leading into a selection. But that's only a small fraction of your bigger training plan. So you can get away with doing a lot of time-based stuff like, hey, 60-minute zone 2 or whatever for a long time. And then when you get to where you need to get specific with it, that's when you can inject more deliberate distance-based stuff.
It also dramatically simplifies the task of trying to monitor volume week to week to make sure you're being consistent and progressing slowly. Like if you're doing it in miles and you have to be like, well, A group ran this many miles and B group ran this many miles. Like if you're just doing time, everybody the same amount of time, we're going to add 10% to that time next week. Cool. Simple.
Yes. And I'll add one more thing on the interval conversation, because I think this is key. And we talked about it earlier and we said we'd bring it up, which is the sustainability piece. If you have two athletes running, let's say they're running 6 400s, the first athlete finishes all 6 of those 400s within 1 to 2 seconds of each other. The second athlete finishes those 6 400s and each one gets progressively slower because they're just going all out every single time. That's 2 very different training sessions. And I would argue that the one who's able to show sustainability is in a better position. And as a coach, from a programming standpoint, what that allows you to do is make fewer changes week to week. So let's say we keep those 6 400s. The first exposure, the athlete's kind of all over the place with their paces. The second exposure, it tightens up a little bit. The third exposure tightens up a little bit. Maybe by the fourth time they see it, they're able to sustain that pace for all 6 400s. That's when I would make the change. But if you're just training folks to go as hard as possible, you're kind of missing the boat in terms of building up a long-term robust athlete. And so, if you're planning PT for your crew and you've got intervals, stress to them that like your first one and your last one should be within 1 to 2 seconds of each other. And that holds true for 400s. It holds true for mile repeats. You can even make that part of your work capacity. If you're doing 2, 5-minute or 5 rounds, you want to see the time on that. And then if you repeat it again, you want to see a similar time. Like sustainability, I think, is ultimately what we're after with the tactical athlete, because rarely in a real world scenario do you want to completely gas yourself and fall flat on the floor. You want to be sustainable, and you can train that effectively if you play with your variables the right way.
Absolutely. And it's something I don't think is necessarily taught to
I think the opposite is taught. I think the opposite.
You see it every time there's a PT test. Somebody comes out the gate sprinting for 90 seconds and then has a miserable time.
Anyway, wrapping up a couple other of these, because we said we were trying to close this thing out. Agility and explosiveness, the only key note I'll put on those kinds of things is that it's really hard and probably a waste of time to design like a whole session focused on those things, but it's really easy to plug them in at the beginning of a session focused on something else, where you do your warm up, you do like a fun, intense, whatever kind of speed work thing, and then you move into something that is like a little bit longer duration, whether it's interval stuff or some sustained aerobic stuff, whatever it is. And then unless Drew has any final notes on that section, I'm going to ask him the question of, given a 5-day week, how many days each would you budget towards strength days versus conditioning days? And this comes with the assumption that you're separating those two, which we have talked about. You don't have to, but how would you budget your 5 days?
If we're looking at the average, I would do, and if we're assuming that there's a recovery day in there, so that gives me 4 days, I would do 2 strength, 2 endurance, just because that's the easiest way to hack it. If I'm dealing with somebody who is not as strong as they would like to be, or not as strong as they need to be for the task or for the test, then bias shifts more towards strength. So maybe then you end up with 3 strength days and 1 conditioning day. Again, if we're holding that recovery day, and vice versa, if somebody does not have a lot of endurance, we might hit 3 conditioning days, 1 strength day. If we get rid of the recovery day entirely, because we assume that they can recover on the weekends and they can tolerate 5 days of training in a row without stopping, earlier in my career, I did this, I would have 3 strength days and 2 endurance days. I would actually change that now, and I would have 3 endurance days and 2 strength days. I think you can get away with way less strength than you think you need. And like we mentioned before, you can add way more endurance than you probably currently are. The question then becomes, how do you kind of manage those variables so that you don't just run your face into the wall? But I'll pause there and see if that brought about any thoughts.
Yeah, I'm going to riff a few random thoughts that won't necessarily seem related. One is like active recovery days, and you use the term tolerate, and people can tolerate a lot. It's how much can you recover from and positively adapt from. And I think that's a distinction that's useful to make, because Army leaders will like look for how much can you tolerate, and more is always better and that kind of stuff. What we're really looking for is like dosing it at a point where their adaptation currency can keep up with it. And that's where you get into a conversation about an active recovery day. Active recovery days don't need to just be like a bunch of guys foam rolling or doing yoga necessarily. There's lots you can do in there. You could build in skill work during an active recovery day. If you're trying to like introduce something more skill based, you could work on the technique of it during an active recovery day. There's a ton of things you could do that are active recovery. You might need to call it something else. We ran into that a lot with like first sergeants and sergeant majors don't want to see active recovery on the PT calendar. So you might need to like hide it under the guise of like flexibility, mobility, or skill or technique, or like just put a name on it that sergeant major likes a little more. Who knows? The other piece of this is realizing how few actual consistent, uninterrupted 5-day weeks people have in a tactical environment, and having a plan that is like readily set up so you know which day gets cut when you miss training, either like you know it ahead because there's like Veterans Day weekends coming up. Maybe you have Veterans Day weekend, you know you're going to have like a 3 or 4 day week on one side of it or the other. You know which ones to cut or in which ones to prioritize. So make sure that's built into your plan. I will shout out a very popular post, and I'll share it whenever this podcast episode gets published. But Coach Brad Godbold did a guest post a while back where he showed an example of a rotation. And it's a way, like part of the reason is to like maximize if you have limited equipment. It would be stupid to have everybody run on the same day and the limited equipment you do have not getting used. Makes a lot more sense to have some kind of rotation set up across the unit so that somebody every day is using whatever equipment you do have. That would be intelligent. What else comes from that conversation?
I'll add one thing to this, and it doesn't necessarily run counter to what you just said in terms of rotating around depending on equipment, but to me, what I would argue is kind of the ideal way to lay this week out as we talk about strength and endurance. And we'll go off of like the 2 strength, 2 endurance, 1 recovery day concept here. Like bias the beginning of your week more towards the higher intensity stuff. So that could be heavier lifting, that could be speed work. And then the end of the week, that's where you can introduce your lower intensity or your volume stuff. And so taking that one step further, one of the things I like to do when I start with new athletes is figure out when we think about a lifting session, like what is the most fatiguing? Is it the squatting? Is it the deadlifting? And that then becomes the session that we do earlier in the week alongside the intervals, alongside the speed. So we're talking like Monday, Tuesday at this point, because I think we talked about this with Alec when we had him on, the consolidation of stressors idea. I think there's a lot to be said about clumping like stressors together to reduce fatigue. And what that basically means is that if we do, let's say, for example, we do heavy legs on Monday and then we do interval work on Thursday. Well, we're going to take a lot of fatigue from Monday into Tuesday and Wednesday. And then maybe we feel good by Thursday, but then we're going to hammer the legs again with speed. So basically we're just always smoked in the lower body. Whereas if we do heavy lifting and speed early in the week, we consolidate that stress to Monday, Tuesday. And then by the time we get to the end of the week, we're feeling okay. And so, Wednesday can be kind of a tempo day. Thursday can be an active recovery day. Friday can be an upper body day because that doesn't necessarily tax your quote unquote endurance or conditioning muscles. Usually those are your legs. And then Saturday, if we're getting into the weekend, or Friday, if we want to keep it in the week, that's where we can inject a lot of the volume stuff, the longer distance work. So that consolidation of stressors idea, I think, is an important one to consider once you've established the number of strength days and the number of endurance days you want to do in a given week.
Dig it. I'll throw out a concept here. I don't know how feasible it is necessarily. It's been something I've like wanted to see. And I know I've seen a few units that like have human performance people start to figure this out a little bit. The phrase ability groups gets used all the time, where we're all going to do the same kind of session. We're just going to do it at a different intensity or a different volume based on our current ability level. I think that's pretty straightforward. That makes sense to a lot of people. I would love to see needs-based programming where different groups might be doing entirely different workouts depending on their needs rather than their ability, so to speak. And to help that make sense, Drew talked earlier about Like somebody might do 3 conditioning days and 1 strength day in a week if they need to focus more on their conditioning, and somebody else might do 3 strength days and 1 conditioning day in their week if they need to focus more on their strength. That implies then that different members of the same relatively small organization have to be able to do different types of training on the same day. And that can get uncomfortable because you might have to split up your squad or your platoon or whatever. And we're not used to that. But I think if we were able to incorporate a little bit of that, it could be really cool in terms of the outcomes, because now we're starting to get to that individualized concept that we say we're aspiring to.
Yeah, I mean, you could even take it a step further. And I actually consulted with some Australians on this before, because they had the same kind of question. And I don't necessarily think that this is appropriate for everybody, but you can also consider, if you do have a relatively mature in terms of decision making group, you could create a month of sessions or a week of sessions or 2 weeks of sessions, and then each athlete can complete those in whatever order they decide to do. And then by the time that time frame is done, they should have completed. And you can even take it a step further and say, hey, of these 10 sessions, these are the higher intensity ones, these are the lower intensity, these are the volume ones, and you have to complete a certain number of each one. Like, you can play with that concept a lot. Mladen Jovanovic is one of the guys out there that talks about this kind of open chain programming concept, I think is what he calls it. But again, I don't advocate that for everybody, because it does surrender a lot of decision making to the athlete. And there is a tendency for folks, if they don't do it right, to just kind of bias the things that they want to do. But I have seen it work in groups where, to your point, you do want to make sure that everybody's hitting the thing that they need to hit based on needs. And that's one way to play with it. It's not the way, but it's one way.
There's obviously a lot more we could talk about, but we're starting to run long here. So I'm just going to throw out like a silly, kind of dumb anecdotal story that I was thinking about as you were talking about what to do on which days of the week. There's one school of thought that says do a little bit of like quote unquote functional overreaching right before the weekend, because they're going to get a couple of days of rest. So like go hard on Friday or whatever, like throw in like a competition thing or throw in something high intensity or whatever it is. That's fine. I would take a minute to like get to understand your people and what they're planning to do and what their weekends consist of, because not everybody's weekends are recovery necessarily. And I know for me, there was a lot of that happening, but in the winters in Colorado as a lieutenant, the one thing I knew for damn sure was that Saturday at 8 a.m. I would be on a chairlift on Peak 7 of Breckenridge. That was like all but guaranteed. And that meant that if somebody decided to program some kind of intense workout on Friday, I was going to sandbag the hell out of it. Unavoidable. Even if I was the one who programmed the workout, I was going to sandbag it because I wanted to be fresh on Saturday. So like keep that in mind. A lot of people operate under the assumption that like soldiers are like exceptionally lazy and will not do anything remotely physical on the weekend. And that's not always a true statement. And hopefully we're cultivating a culture where it is not the case. So keeping that kind of stuff in mind too might be helpful. That was just a random thought.
No, I think it's a point that I wanted to bring up, which is the goal of training is not to survive it. It's to, and this sounds cheesy, but it's to thrive off of it. So you should walk away feeling good from more sessions than you do feeling bad. That's not to say that you should never go hard. Like there's a time and a place to crush yourself. But that should not be the standard. The standard should be you go in, you do the session, the quality is great, and then you're done and you feel good. And you can repeat that over and over and over again. And when the time comes to do, because everybody loves a good hero workout. It's great to do that kind of stuff. I think there's there's a lot to be said about camaraderie and team building. But if the standard at your organization is to throw a bunch of those into a hat and then pull one out every day, and that's your workout, you're just like, you might as well go outside and just like throw darts at each other, because it's about
back to the original goal of shouting out as many episodes as possible. That's a great opportunity to shout out Vince's money quote from his episode, that it's not about swinging the hammer as hard as you can every day. It's about being ready to swing the hammer hard when the appropriate time comes.
Shout out Vince.
You produce that through consistency, not destroying yourself with intensity.
That's a good wrap up. Should we wrap up?
All right. Night.
Thanks for listening, guys. Hopefully that was effective. And like we said, we'd like to do more of these. So if you do have specific questions on training, or if there are rabbit holes you want us to dive down, reach out. We're happy to do it.
Later.
Hey guys, Drew here. Thanks for listening to the episode. If you found it useful or enjoyed the conversation, we'd appreciate you giving us a review on the podcast platform of your choice. You can also give us a follow on the MOPs MOEs Instagram. And if you'd like to reach out, send us a message on Instagram or shoot us an email at mopsmoes@gmail.com. Thanks.